Hello everyone from Tokyo, Japan. So welcome to another video. And this video is still part of my long series on effective practicing. And I started this series a number of weeks ago. So if you haven't yet, please check out the old videos. And today's video is a direct continuation of last week's video where we talked about different approaches to learning what we call the jazz blues. And today we're going to do the same with the rhythm changes form. For those of you who are used to this channel, well, you guessed it, it's time for me to plug a few things. Thanks so very much to those of you who have bought stuff from SoundSlice or DC Music School. It makes a huge difference, and it is what ultimately allows me to make these free in-depth YouTube videos. For those of you who don't know, I am the owner of DC Music School, and I also have some lessons on the SoundSlice platform, and you'll find all the relevant links in the description box. While we're at it, as always, if you like the content, then please consider subscribing, liking, clicking on the bell notification, commenting, because all this seems to encourage the YouTube algorithm into promoting my channel and reaching new people. It really does seem to work when you guys actually engage with the content. I've been noticing like more and more comments and more people watching older videos. So thank you so much. Before I continue, I need to thank JES International for providing me with this amazing Godin guitar. JES International is the official distributor for Godin guitars here in Japan, and they're also the official distributor for a number of other companies such as Fishman Pickups, Phil Jones Amplification, Tom Anderson Guitars, and many other wonderful companies. So thank you so very much. I really appreciate it. So let's get started. The rhythm changes. So I'm not going to talk about the exact history of the evolution of the rhythm changes form because it's a huge topic and it's actually something that I'm still kind of studying. For those of you who don't know, maybe I should explain what a rhythm changes is, because some people have asked me what makes a rhythm changes so special, in the sense that that they don't hear any rhythm changing. The term rhythm changes comes from two things: a composition called I've Got Rhythm by George Gershwin, and the term chord changes, the chord progression. So Gershwin's song was very popular among jazz musicians, and they like to play it. Like to play it is an understatement. It's a very important form in the jazz culture. Anyway, at one point, musicians started composing their own melodies based on the chord changes of this tune, I've Got Rhythm. So then you take the word rhythm from I've Got Rhythm and the word changes from chord changes, and you got rhythm changes. So the chord progression of I've Got Rhythm. So that's what the term rhythm changes refers to. The original chord progression of this tune by George Gershwin was quite different from what people play nowadays. I think it was in the key of D flat, and it's actually not so important to know what it was, since it won't exactly help us for today's video. But if you do want to know what it was, well, you can listen to it, or you can go on SoundSlice and check out my harmony course, where I do talk about the historical evolution of the chord progression in detail. What I do want to talk about is what happened at some point. Jazz musicians in the 30s started recording their own version of this tune, and it was a fairly popular tune in the 30s. Well, actually, no, it was not fairly. It was very popular. So popular that some musicians started taking the form and composing their own melodies to the form itself, maybe as a way to get past copyright. I don't know. So for this video, my goal is to offer you a few different ways of thinking about the rhythm changes based on its historical evolution. And to be very clear, we're only going to be talking about the A section of the tune. It is normally an AABA form, and the B part is usually considered the easiest part. So if you're watching this video, hopefully you do know what the rhythm changes structure is, at least the way it's commonly played nowadays. If you're not, then maybe this video is a step above your pay grade and you'll have to watch other videos from someone else before you watch this one. The A section is where you can find many variations harmonic variations, and where a lot of beginners often feel very confused. And even pros sometimes don't like playing over this chord progression because it's a special chord progression that has its feet in two worlds, one foot in this world and one foot in an entirely different world. Basically, one can treat the A section like a modal tune, or they can treat it like a normal tune with standard chord progressions. So you basically have these two extremes, which means as an improviser, you have the possibility of being anywhere on the spectrum. And it's a lot like the blues that we talked about last week. So when you treat it like a modal tune, you can kind of stay in just one chord or one key, so to speak. But if you treat it as a chord progression with very specific chords, then your job is to outline the chords as well as you possibly can. And then, of course, you can do anything in between. So when you ask a jazz pro, a lot of them will tell you that you can do anything over the A section. And it definitely is true. But from a beginner perspective, and even from a professional perspective, the fact that you can do anything doesn't mean that doing any random thing will sound good. I think you need quite a lot of experience to be able to make anything sound good. On the other hand, if you focus strictly on the chord changes, if you don't understand how the chord changes work, it can quickly become very tiresome, very limited, and even difficult to play. So basically, we're going to talk about both aspects. Some pros that I know don't like playing over rhythm changes, even though I think they sound good at it. But I also understand where they're coming from. Actually, I'm the same way. I can play over the rhythm changes, and I could probably do something decent. I mean, if you liked what I played at the beginning of this video, then keep watching. But yeah, I definitely don't consider myself like a true expert of being able to play over rhythm changes. Not by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I know enough to survive. And why is that? Because some players have spent quite a lot of time working on the various intricacies of the progression. And of course, just like any other tune, the more work you put into it, the better you get at it. But at the same time, because this A section of the rhythm changes has so many possibilities, so many intricacies, it can take a lot more time and feel a little bit more overwhelming than working on a song like Autumn Leaves, for example. You can make it as complex or as simple as you want, and even when you keep it simple, it's like the blues. You can't adhere to a very specific formula. You have to have this feeling. But yeah, we'll get to that in a second. Nowadays, when people teach rhythm changes, it's likely to be the music school version, just like the jazz blues last week. There can be a number of little variations, but essentially it might look something like this. I'll play it once. So what did I do? I did B flat, G7, C minor, F7. Then I did D minor 7, G7, C minor 7, F7. Then F minor 7, B flat 7, E flat, and here I did E diminished. Then I did D minor, G7, C minor 7, F7, B flat. That brings us to the second A. So this first A has a what I call an open ending. It's just a word that I came up with right now. I don't know if other people use it. Open ending means that the ending does not actually resolve. It leads us back to the second A. So the second A could be, I'll play another variation. So this second A, what I did, at the end, I have a closed ending, which is to say that I resolve the chord progression at the end. So I do B flat, G7, C minor, C sharp diminished, D minor 7, D flat minor 7, C minor 7, F7, F minor 7, B flat 7, E flat, A flat 13, B flat, and a quick 2-5, back to B flat. Closed ending, where I resolved it here before moving on to the B section. So essentially you have the first A and the second A. And I made the first and second A just a little bit different to show you some tiny variations here and there. But often it's mix and match. And then we have this B section, D7, G7, C7, F7. And then we have another A. Now you can either play the first A or the second A, depending on whether you want to close it, whether you want to resolve it at the end, or if you want to keep it open and then resolve it when it reaches the top of the form, in which case you play the first A. Okay, so that's the typical music school way, but let's look at how people approach it in the 1930s. So just like the blues, it wasn't standardized in one particular way, and it wasn't necessarily always in the key of B flat as it is today. The first thing we have to understand is the harmonic direction of the song. So harmonic direction is a term that I personally came up with. I don't know if anyone else uses it, but some people also call it function. And when jazz is often taught, there's often an emphasis on learning to play the changes, which, while important, is not all there is to jazz improvisation, or at least within the bebop or swing styles. The idea of harmonic direction is about understanding where the chord progressions are going, and when you understand that, there is a level of flexibility in terms of using chord substitutions in the rhythm playing and or the soloing. And how much flexibility there is, well, it depends on the musician, depends on the era, the style of jazz. In the earliest styles of jazz, the rhythm sections did not really deviate too much, and it was usually the soloists who would imply other changes in their improvisation. And sometimes these changes didn't match exactly what the rhythm sections were doing, but from a harmonic direction point of view, they generally resolved in the same direction. So that's what I mean by harmonic direction. And by the way, my harmony course on Sound Slice is all about this concept of harmonic direction. So one way to understand where the rhythm changes comes from in terms of harmonic direction would be to look at the phrasing of the melody of the tune, I've Got Rhythm. So just like the blues, it's actually in 3 parts. You have a 2-bar statement, followed by another 2-bar statement, then a 4-bar phrase that concludes the whole thing. So here it is. That's the first statement. Second statement, and then the conclusion. And notice that in this third part, the resolution is on bar 4. Bar 4. That's where it resolves traditionally. So that's the A section of the rhythm changes. And like I said, some musicians started composing their own melodies on the A section or on the entire form of the rhythm changes. Now, what constitutes a rhythm change is a bit up for debate. Does it have to be roughly this exact structure with the same B section, D7, G7, C7, F7? Or can it be just the A section and then with a completely different B section? Because if that's the case, the latter, Django Reinhardt wrote a number of tunes on just the A section, the chord progression, but with a completely different B section. Songs like Daphne, Belleville, Swing 42, Swing Guitars, and many others. But he also wrote rhythm changes. He also wrote melodies using the exact same chord structure, meaning the same A section or variations of the A section and the same B section. So Django Reinhardt was definitely very interested in this form. And then outside of Django Reinhardt, there are other tunes like that, such as Airmail Special 7:11 that Charlie Christian recorded. And even in the 30s, some musicians wrote their own melodies to the entire structure. So there's I think it's called Shag by Sidney Bechet. Shag or Swag? Shag, I think. There is a tune called Don't Be That Way by Edgar Sampson. It was recorded by Chick Webb and Benny Goodman. And there are a few other tunes out there. I think there was also a song called Hey Man by Fletcher Henderson. That was an early one, 1932 or something like that. We'll have to look it up. Sorry, I didn't really research this properly before recording this. Kind of off the top of my head. And I think it was around the 40s and 50s that many musicians start to write a whole bunch of new melodies on the rhythm changes form. And I think Charlie Parker was a huge contributor to the popularization of the rhythm changes for jazz musicians. Otherwise, in the 1930s, people just recorded the actual tune, I've Got Rhythm. And of course, I Got Rhythm has a little tag at the end. That little tag. Some people choose to omit it, some people put it for the melody and then omit it for the solos. Everything's been done. For this video, we care less about this I've Got Rhythm tune, and more about rhythm changes in general. Anyway, it's very interesting to listen to a whole bunch of recordings of this form from the 1930s, because then you will hear a number of variations, because as I said, things weren't quite standardized yet. And furthermore, in the 1930s, people were generally less harmonically adventurous as opposed to, let's say, Miles Davis group from the 1950s and onwards. With that group, the Miles Davis group, where, for example, every chorus, the pianist would play different sets of harmonies with different substitutions, and the bass player would do the same. Like they would play the bass player, what was his name? Paul Chambers would play his own sets of harmonies, and sometimes it didn't match what the piano player was doing. So this is an example. Miles Davis Band is a perfect example of taking harmonic direction to a certain extreme end of the spectrum. Whereas in the 1930s, everything tended to be a little bit more conservative, meaning that they would roughly always play the same chord progressions from chorus to chorus. And most of the time, the bass player and the rhythm player, piano player, guitar players roughly played the same chords. So let me play you a few examples of how people might have recorded rhythm changes in the 1930s. In no particular order, no historical order anyway, because I don't think there is an exact historical order. Musicians harmonize the melody in the way that they felt sounded good for the recording. So you have this one where it's just B flat, G minor, C minor, F7, 1 6 2 5. So you have this very basic one, which is just 1 6 2 5, and the 6 is just minor, not 6 dominant like as we tend to play nowadays. And it would sound something like this. So notice what I did. I only played 1 6 2 5. So I did it 3 times. And then I did that resolution thing. 1 5 1. So that's how some musicians record it. And then there was another slight variation. Instead of G minor, some people would play D flat diminished. So it'd be and then a slight variation. Instead of B flat, D flat diminished, you have also B flat slash D. First inversion, you have this voice leading. And then there's a recording by Django Reinhardt where it's just B flat and F7. And I think Al Bowley had a recording that's very similar. Check out those recordings. And by the way, when they played C minor, typically in the 1930s, they did not play C minor 7. They played C minor triad, or C minor 6. And C minor 6 happens to be the same thing as F9, so it's the same chord. So notice the simplicity of this chord progression. It's always the same chord progression. At most, only 4 different chords, and that, or if not, just 2 chords, 1 and 5. Now, I'm not saying that Django invented this. Well, he definitely did not. But I'd like to think that he might have popularized it, but I have no proof of this. But Django, in some of his mid-1930s rhythm changes compositions, such as Daphne, he had this chord progression. So I'll do it in the key of B flat. So now we have the same chord progression for the first 4 bars, but then from bar 5 we have this thing. And the rhythm players often played E flat minor. Here I played E diminished because it fits the melody. And I think in the recording they played minor. So then we have this new chord progression which gets us closer to the music school variation. Now Django didn't invent this because there's actually a recording by Fletcher Henderson. The song was not Hey Man, I think it was called Yeah Man. And I do think it is from 1932. And it has a similar thing happening in that recording. So this song Yeah Man is based on I've Got Rhythm. But anyway, this is something that Django did in the mid-1930s, and towards the end of the 1930s, I noticed that a lot of jazz musicians in America started to embrace this version of the last 4 bars of the A section. Is it Django's influence? Who knows? Now keep in mind that in the 1930s, songs were generally played in a relatively harmonically conservative fashion. Now I personally don't think it was because the musicians themselves were conservative, but at that time things were new, were being discovered in an organic way. Precedents were being set. You can't know what you don't know. A lot of the things that we do today, we take it for granted. Things like tritone substitutions, altered scales, and all that stuff. In those days, those were all very, very new sounds. And in fact, in those days, in the 1930s, some of those things were unheard of. I can only imagine what it must have been like being in the 30s and in the 40s as a jazz musician, being used to like a few standard ways of playing the rhythm changes. But then as years go by, like in the 40s and the 50s, you start to discover these quote-unquote new hip variations. But by today's standards, they're nothing new at all. So in the 1940s and the 1950s and onwards, that's where you start getting much closer to the music school variations that you learn today. Now let's go back to the topic of phrasing and harmonic direction. So traditionally, it is in 3 parts. But just because it's that way doesn't mean that it has to be that way all the time. In fact, you can interpret it any way you want. For example, you can also make the argument that it's just in 2 parts, 4 bars plus 4 bars. So in your improvisation, you can certainly reflect that kind of phrasing. For example, Lester Leaps In is an example of a melody that follows that formula. How does it go? Does that twice. So that's a formula that's 4 plus 4. And in fact, in that melody, the resolution in the last 4 is on bar 3 instead of bar 4. So this goes to show there is flexibility in the phrasing. Keep that in mind. The point I want to make is that just because traditionally something is one way does not mean it has to be that way all the time. However, the next point that I do want to make is that this tradition was still so strong in those days that this way of phrasing stayed with a lot of musicians for generations and even still today. If you look at John Coltrane's solo on Oleo, you can see some hints of following these traditional phrasing patterns. But again, I do really want to emphasize that you can choose to phrase in any number of ways, in a near infinite number of ways. But it's a good idea to keep the traditional ways in the back of your head. For example, if you look at the last 4 bars of the rhythm changes, this chord progression, traditionally, if you follow the I Got Rhythm melody, the resolution is on bar 4, right? Bar 4. But some people resolve it on bar 3. And actually, one thing that Charlie Parker often liked to do in his improvisations, I noticed, is that he often kind of ended his phrase on beat 3-ish of bar 3. So it's something you can do. But there's some melodies or there's some solos also that resolve on the end, not on the end, on the 3, beat 3 of bar 4. So harmonically, it could look like this. In fact, that Lister leaps in resolves on beat 1 of bar 3. And by the way, I just play these harmonies arbitrarily. It doesn't have to be exactly that. It can be other things. Da-da, da, da-da, da, 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 da. And this is very important when we're going to look at the improvisation aspect of all this. Here we're just talking about the phrasing, not the exact chord progressions. And then there's also closed and open resolution, which we talked about earlier. We're going to talk about that in a second. Basically, what I want to say now is that if you understand these basic chord progressions that I showed earlier, you can start to understand where the music school variations are coming from. So these chord progressions that we looked at, they're nothing new. They've been in place for many generations. They come from classical music, and they come from voice leading. B flat, G minor, C minor, F7, or B flat, D flat diminished, C minor, F7. They're coming from voice leading. And then from a music school perspective, they started to explore new pathways. So instead of B flat to G minor, they thought maybe, hey, what if we turn the G minor into a G7? And if we have a G7, then we can have B diminished, and then you have this voice leading. So and then you start to have all these common music school variations of this chord progression. So you have B flat, and then you can have, instead of B flat, you can have D minor, G7, C minor, F7. You can have D minor, D flat minor, C minor, F7. I talk about all these variations in my harmony course, by the way. I explain where everything is coming from a historical perspective. And then you have the second half, where originally I just did 1, 6, 2, 5, but then I showed you the Django thing, B flat, 7. In the music school way, often they will teach, instead of B flat, they'll teach F minor 7 to B flat 7, 2, 5 to get to the 4 chord, E diminish, and then you could have D minor 7, G7, C minor, F7 for the first A. So it would sound something like this. So that's the first A. The second A, the first A, which I call an open A because it doesn't resolve. The second A can be this: F minor 7, B flat 7, E flat, E diminished, B flat 2, 5, 1. Closed A, you resolve. So whether you have a closed ending or an open ending, again, this is also related to phrasing and harmonic direction. Do you want to close the phrase there or not? It's entirely up to you. What I want you to do is start to relate this to other chord progressions. Let's say you're playing a song like Autumn Leaves. You're improvising over the chord progression. And regardless of what the rhythm section is doing, you can be soloing over this chord progression. F7, B flat, E flat, A minor 7 flat 5, D7, D minor 7 flat 5 to G7 to C minor. So this is an open ending. You don't resolve to the G minor. You play a D minor 7, which is the 2 of G7 going to C minor. Pretty clever, huh? It's the equivalent of playing F minor in bar 5 of the rhythm changes instead of B flat. Now let's talk about what we can play over this A section. This is super complex because of what I mentioned earlier. All these different variations, all these phrasing possibilities, and also because things can depend on what sound you are going for. If you're going for a very specific sound, such as 1930s jazz versus bebop, well, it's not the same vocabulary. And of course, you don't have to go for any of those sounds. You can go for something completely different as well. Nowadays, there are players who take it in a whole other direction. We're not even gonna go there because I'm not an expert in that at all. But for this video, I just want to scratch the surface from a historical perspective. If we take it from the perspective that we have to play the changes, well, you notice it's too many chords to be think about, and that even if we succeed at nailing each and every chord, it gets very tiring very quickly. Right, you're not going to play this way all the time. We'll talk about that in a second, but what a lot of musicians did was simplify things and just think in terms of being in the key of B flat. So basically, a B flat modal tune would be a good starting point, but then you have to think about phrasing and resolution. And that example that I gave earlier of Lester Leapson is a very, very good example. It's all in the key of B flat, using notes from B flat. Kind of sounds bluesy, but it's played with intelligence, with phrasing and tension and resolution. Now, what I want to do is split things in two. We're going to have the first half, which is just 1, 6, 2, 5, or whatever variation you have in your head. And then the second half where we have this. Let's look at the first half first. Okay, I mentioned that you can just think in terms of B flat major. But if you want to add a little bit of harmonic substance, we can think in terms of B flat and F7. So like this. And now instead of thinking F7 to get a quote-unquote jazzier sound, whether bebop or swing, what a lot of jazz musicians did is think C minor. Instead of F7, think C minor. Doesn't have to be C minor 7. It can be just C minor triad. It can be C minor 6. It can be C minor 7, C minor major 7. It depends on the sound you're going for. And I've talked about this substitution before, but they're essentially the same chords. If you play a C minor 6 over F7, it's basically playing an F9 chord. And playing strictly the notes of a C minor brings out a certain flavor out of that F7. And I talk a lot about this in many of my sound slice courses. So you can have something like this. Then. So 1 and 5. And then when you start thinking about the F7, F7 is kind of what we call a tension chord. And that's where you can start to have all these different colors. Like you can, instead of thinking F7, you can be thinking F7 with a flat 9. What would be that? So here's a Django Reinhardt thing. So what did I do? Da, 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 de, da, da, dee, do. Can't sing it. And then you have this arpeggio. You start to have a bit of a different color, and of course you have all the different substitutions that you can think of over F7, like using altered and all that stuff. And then there's the diminished sound, and this is where it's a little bit special, because when we use, well, at least traditionally speaking, when we use the diminished sound over rhythm changes or over blues, it is less about a scale like the octatonic scale. It's not quite about playing arpeggios. It's about the phrasing as well and how you use the diminished sound. So it's not like you're going to be practicing your diminished arpeggio like this. But you want to have some kind of a rhythmic vibe to it. So you can be like, well, what I did in the beginning of my solo, in the intro performance, I did something like this. It has to be rhythmic. So you can come up with different rhythms, maybe like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, something like that. So when we use the diminished sound in this style, it's to bring about a bluesy flavor. Then, I mean, I'm going by very quickly because this is not an actual detailed improv class. But the second half of the A section, beyond just playing the blues or staying in modally in the key of B flat, there are a few simplifications out there depending again on the sound you are going for. From a phrasing perspective, you have to decide whether it is that you want to resolve. Is it a closed or open ending, as we discussed earlier? And then where do you want to resolve? So one way to harmonically simplify things is to think just F minor for one whole bar, then E flat minor, and come up with a simple motif for the E flat and E flat minor, something like this. Actually, to be honest, this is a very, very difficult chord progression. I don't want to use the chord progression, a difficult section to be talking about, because I don't want to use the word chord progression, because as soloist you can be implying so many different chord progressions depending where you want to go. Like some people, they completely ignore this and think up something much simpler or something completely different. Some people do a very long 2-5-1 and resolving to 1 at any given point, really. For example, one thing that Django did is think just B flat, 2, 5. That would be for the second half of the rhythm changes. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And this is the part where I again stress the importance of listening to a lot of great musicians to absorb, try to absorb what they were doing in terms of phrasing, in terms of lines, in terms of harmonies and all that stuff. Because if you're going for a very specific sound, or even if you're not, you still have to do a lot of listening, because musically, I think things rarely come out of a vacuum. We are influenced by our environment. And even the most original musicians were inspired by their predecessors or their contemporaries. Because I could sit down here and give you a list of a whole bunch of formulas, but they don't mean anything if you don't have them in your ear. And the way to get them in your ear is to listen to them. And maybe you won't understand what the concept is in the beginning, but at least you'll hear it so much that you'll start to have a feel for it. I know it's kind of hard to explain. It's kind of like a language. How is it that babies can learn their mother tongue without understanding the grammar and the intricacies of the language? Well, it's just that they hear it all the time and they have no choice but to absorb it. And yes, I could give you a whole bunch of licks. By the way, I do have a licks course on SoundSlice on how to construct bebop licks, but I digress. I know many people want licks and all that, like not licks, but like very simple formulas where they can just apply one formula and then they think you can play everything. But it's just not how it works, in my opinion, especially if you really want to make good art. Music is about listening, and you just need to absorb certain things. You got to spend time listening attentively. So watch my previous videos where I talk about how to transcribe, how to listen, and all that. Like if you want to sound like Louis Armstrong, then you need to be listening to Louis Armstrong or musicians from that era, because he has his own approach over that chord progression. I certainly, while I could give you a whole bunch of licks, it would take me so much more time. And this is a free lesson. It's already taken me quite a lot of time to make this, so I need to condense things. If you want phrases, then I suggest you check out some of the artists on my DC Music School to see how they approach the rhythm changes. I suggest you choose an artist whose style you might like, because everyone will have their own approach. Now let's move on to the other extreme, where we're not really simplifying things, where we're trying to actually nail each and every chord change, or at least to a certain extent. And this is where it gets complicated, because which chords are you supposed to play over? And this is actually up for debate, because different players will have different opinions on this, as far as the rhythm section is concerned anyway. Some feel that the rhythm section shouldn't deviate too much from the basic chord progression, and the term deviate is up for debate as well. For example, pianists, guitarists, bassists should be roughly, playing roughly the same thing from chorus to chorus. And others feel there could be a lot more deviation in terms of the harmonies. Me, personally, coming from a bebop perspective, as long as I can always hear where the rhythm section is, then I'm okay with whatever they do, whatever variation. Because there are some rhythm sections that have fun going really way out there to the point where my ears cannot catch what they're doing. That I tend not to like. But if I'm looking at things from a more conservative perspective, like if I'm playing swing music, that's where I feel that, okay, maybe we shouldn't do some of these adventurous chord progressions. There are certain chord progressions that I wouldn't use, and I would stick to a variation from the list that I showed you earlier at the beginning of this video. Now, as a soloist, you have a lot more flexibility. And from a bebop perspective, you can outline whichever changes you want. So it can be any combination of, let's say, if we just take this first 4 bars or first 2 bars, it can be this, it can be this, it can be this, it can be this. Like quite a number of variations. It can be any of those chord progressions that I just played. And just so that I don't repeat myself, I suggest you watch my video about practicing licks from a few weeks ago. It has a clickbait title that says something like, "Don't practice improvisation, practice licks." It's more nuanced than that though. Because this is exactly what someone like Charlie Parker did, or John Coltrane. He had a lot of ideas that he repeated and that he had under his muscle memory. And sometimes, every now and then, he would place tiny little variations on the muscle memory phrases. Because unless you do this muscle memory work, it's very, very hard to freely improvise over fast-changing chord progressions, where especially there are a near infinite number of variations. For example, if you told me to come up with a line that outlines this, well, I have others. Or for example, if I have to outline this, I have this. Or variation, where I end on this note as opposed to this note. Or if I have to outline something like this, 1. If I have to outline this, and then you can combine ideas together. And I bring this up because for the last 4 bars, like I've been checking out Charlie Parker. Well, he has a lot of the same ideas all the time. Well, not all the time, but quite often. A lot of repeated ideas. And sometimes with little tiny variations here and there, but you can definitely tell where the ideas were coming from. And you can tell that it was well rehearsed. Same thing with Django Reinhardt. And I personally stole quite a few ideas from Charlie Parker, and I would often modify a few notes to make them my own. One thing that I should say is that when you're learning from other musicians, you don't necessarily have to exactly copy what they do unless you feel it's that important for whatever reason. But one thing that I do that I like to do anyway is take the basic idea, the basic color, and make them my own in one way or another. And this often happens when I'm listening to horn players or piano players, because sometimes some of those lines don't translate very well to the guitar, and that's where I take way more liberties in modifying certain things. And I definitely did a lot of that with Red Garland, Charlie Parker, and other like horn players, piano players. Like here's one phrase from Charlie Parker that I took over the last 4 bars. So he's thinking E flat. So he's thinking B flat 7, E flat, E diminished. Here's another idea that I stole from Charlie Parker. I took this idea from him, but I actually changed quite a lot of notes. I don't even remember what Charlie Parker played exactly, but it's an idea from him. It goes like this. So it's the same chord progression. So here, well, I changed the notes so that it's outlining this. Here's another Charlie Parker idea. And again, it might not be exactly what he did, it's just something that I modified. Actually, in this case, it's outlining B flat, F minor, B flat augmented, E flat. How does it go? E flat minor. So this is starting to become a very long video. The main point I wanted to talk about here, just like last week, is this concept of phrasing and this concept of harmonic direction, which is very, very critical in the rhythm changes form. And if you're a beginner at this, it's probably a better idea to focus on the simpler side of things, kind of staying within the world of B flat, and to train your ears to hear the resolution points, so that even if you're playing just using B flat or just some bluesy ideas, that you can at least resolve them quote unquote correctly. There is actually one player that I really like, who tends to play simple over rhythm changes, and it's Frank Vignola. He's a really, really, really good guy to study. He keeps things fairly bluesy and generally traditional in terms of phrasing. So he's a good guy to listen to get your ears used to these simple sounds. And as you get used to these sounds, it can be kind of like a springboard to launch yourself towards more adventurous sounds. Anyway, for now, this concludes my my rhythm changes video. I hope it gives you certain things to think about. Check out some of the recordings that I talked about as well.